Tomorrow is CBC British Columbia's 39th annual day of special programming in support of Food Banks B.C.'s 111 food banks. The event is called Make the Season Kind. And my colleague Ann Penman coordinates the event. She has for the last 39 years. And every year, thank you so much for being here, first of all, but every year before Food Bank Day, you go and visit some of our province's food banks. You know, what did you see and hear this year?
Well, it was interesting. I saw more seniors, I saw more young families and more newcomers in the lineups. For example, I spoke to a woman from Brazil whose husband is working full-time, and she can't work because the cost of daycare is more than she could make at a job. She's a physician, in fact, but she needs to study here for at least 2 years and improve her English a bit to get on the path to be able to practice here. But so there she is at the food bank.
Right.
Also spoke to a man who worked as a garbage collector. He fell off a truck last year and is on disability, but can't cover rent and utilities. So he goes to get his groceries at a food bank, but he hopes to get back to work soon, although can't do a physically demanding job anymore. But in the meantime, he needs the help. And then there was a senior, which was really sad, told me that a couple of his friends who need to go to a food bank go to one that's an hour away from their home because they don't want to see anyone they know. They're afraid of the stigma. I also spoke to clients who are very grateful that they have the resource of a food bank. And I spoke to many people who work as volunteers at the food banks as well and really enjoy being able to help and give back to their community.
Yeah, very meaningful indeed. So, and so this week we were reporting on the fact that Food Banks B.C. released their second annual hunger report. What were some of the highlights that stood out to you in that report?
Yeah, the report called, this was the biggest one, the report called the increasing reliance on food banks, and I quote, an unprecedented food security crisis here in British Columbia. The demand is so great that it reports that 10% of its food banks regularly actually have to turn away clients. The other statistic that's kind of shocking, that there's a 79% increase in food bank visits since 2019. And over this past year, they've also reported that about 20% of people using food banks in British Columbia are employed. Factors that bring them to a food bank are the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, job insecurity. Almost 1 in 4 British Columbians are facing food insecurity.
Wow, those numbers are indeed so stark, right? There's a lot of need out there. And so, Anne, as I mentioned off the top, you've been involved with this project. You've been leading it for almost 4 decades. You know, what's kind of changed for you as you've watched food bank operations?
Oh, well, you know, there's a lot that's changed for sure. The food banks, especially the larger ones in communities like Vancouver, they're much more sophisticated and more efficient in their operations than in the past. They have partnerships with grocery stores and with farmers, and they've lobbied governments at all levels for funding and other supports for people who are food insecure. Unfortunately, what hasn't changed in my experience is the fact that the number of people have grown. The number of people that have lined up outside of food banks is getting longer and longer. They're often standing in the rain, or mostly in the rain at this time of year, waiting for their turn to enter the distribution center and collect food for themselves and their families. That's not nice to see.
Right, absolutely. And hopefully, you know, as our efforts from all of our listeners and viewers, that they pour in those donations that can go to contribute to that, right?
We have an incredibly generous CBC audience here in British Columbia, incredibly generous.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. This is Ann Penman, a CBC producer who produces Make the Season Kind every year. Thank you.
As part of the big team.